Hello and welcome to Unstress. I'm Dr. Ron Ehrlich. Well, today we're going to cover quite a range, pulling together sunlight, cholesterol, introduce you to sulphates, which you may not have heard about before, but as you will hear are critically important. Vitamin D, melatonin, glyphosate, biofuel, biomass. Oh, it's a far-ranging, very holistic view of some very important issues. My guest today is Dr. Stephanie Seneff. Stephanie is a senior research scientist at M.I.T's Computer Science and Artificial Intelligence Laboratory. She's got a Bachelor of Science from M.I.T in biology and a PhD from M.I.T, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in Boston, in electrical engineering and computer science. Her research interests have focused on the role of toxic chemicals and micronutrient deficiencies in health and disease, with a special emphasis, as you will hear, on glyphosate Roundup. She's authored over 36 peer-reviewed journal papers in recent years on these very topics. And I first came into contact and became aware of her when I joined the Thinks group, which is an international network of cholesterol skeptics some 10 or 12 years ago, which brings together an amazing group of very highly qualified people to question some of the norms. And we go into some of that in this podcast. So I hope you enjoy this conversation I had with Dr. Stephanie Seneff. Welcome to the show, Stephanie.
So great to be here. Thank you.
Stephanie, there is so much I wanted to talk to you about today, but I wondered if before we started, you might share with our listener a bit about your own journey, your professional journey, and that's brought you to this point.
Yeah, it's quite interesting. Most of my career I actually spent in computer science. I have an undergraduate degree in biology, and I switched over to computer science for my graduate work, all at MIT, PhD in electrical engineering and computer science. I never left MIT, so I've always worked there. I love the place. And and as I said, most of my career was spent developing spoken dialogue systems that are precursors to things like Amazon Echo and Siri, computer-human interaction using speech, spoken language. So it was great. I mean, I really enjoyed it. I was doing some work on language learning, actually, when I finally started getting interested in biology, going back to biology. And I had a great project I was doing with many students, supervising students doing research on developing games, computer games, language games to help people learn a second language, like specifically help English-speaking people learn Chinese. I was very passionate about it. I really loved it. But I got worried about autism. It kind of derailed the whole project. So I kind of just let my students graduate and moved on. It's really been, pretty much biology has been a real passion for me ever since maybe 2007, 2008, when I got worried about autism and felt that it wasn't being properly addressed and that the government wasn't sufficiently worried about the situation. And I think I was right. We've continued to have increasing rates of autism in the United States every year since then. And it's completely out of hand right now. 1 in 54 kids in the United States have autism. There's no chatter about it. I mean, the media don't care. The government doesn't care. And, you know, parents are in heartache dealing with these children they can't fix. And I meet so many autistic parents that are, try this, try that. I mean, they're desperate for a solution. It breaks my heart. So,
and I mean, just to remind our listener, in case they didn't know, I think something like 25 or more years ago, the rates were 1 in 5,000.
Yeah, exactly. It's just gone up and up and up, particularly since 2000. And of course, I was looking for reasons why that might be. Being a computer scientist, I can number crunch, I can do correlations, you know, so I was looking at patterns of disease against patterns of different potential toxic exposures. And I was fussing around for 5 years. I looked pretty seriously at the vaccines. I do think they're a contributing factor. I know that's a hot topic with a lot of controversy.
It's okay. It's okay. You're in a safe place here. We can talk controversy. That's okay.
Oh, that's great. And but I was striking out after 5 years, and I learned a lot about autism. Very complicated disease, many comorbidities, many problems with the guts. You know, gut problems associated with brain problems, and all kinds of issues with food sensitivities and whatnot. And I just couldn't figure out what it was, and very frustrated. And I happened to be at a conference where Professor Don Huber spoke for 2 hours on this thing called glyphosate. I didn't know what it was at the time, I'm embarrassed to admit. And that was about 8 years ago, and I never looked back. I mean, I heard that talk, I was like, wow, this is it. Yeah. I was so convinced, because what he described as potential problems that glyphosate could be causing matched perfectly with the symptoms I was seeing in the autistic kids. And I was just really, really excited. And I went back and we looked at correlations with glyphosate, and it's an absolute perfect match. The rate of autism in first grade, according to the IDEA, which is a service in the United States that provides, help for the autistic, financial help for the autistic kids in first grade. That rate was going up exactly perfectly in step with the rise in the use of glyphosate if you integrate it over the previous 4 years. So you're basically looking at that child's exposure to glyphosate over their lifespan, sort of. You can't go much more than 4 years without, getting into statistical trouble, but very, very great correlation.
And we are going to talk about that, and just to flag for our listener as well that glyphosate is known as Roundup. And we can walk around our local parks and sometimes see a sign saying glyphosate or Roundup has been sprayed on this park. So it's out there, not just in the agriculture, It's out there in the urban environment as well.
Absolutely. It's very pervasive. And certainly it's all over the food supply in the United States. And various groups, advocacy groups have tested for it, found it in all kinds of foods that are very popular with children, like Oreo cookies and goldfish crackers and oat cereals, oatmeal and Cheerios. I mean, all these popular foods are contaminated, and parents are not. I mean, they're becoming increasingly aware, and I'm pleased about that. And there's definitely an increase in the use of organic, and the sales of organic, and the availability of organic, and the number of people who are buying organic in the United States. We're seeing a real movement, and I really appreciate that. I think it's going to work bottom up, grassroots. It's not going to work from the government. The government is absolutely stubborn about even hearing the message. They're not doing anything. They don't seem to care that there's a problem. And I think it's going to ruin the country if we continue on this track. So I've been very, very disturbed about autism. Simultaneously with the autism thing in 2008, I also had a personal crisis, because my husband was diagnosed with heart disease at that time, a complete surprise. And he was put on a statin drug. And I was, as you know, very much against statin drugs. So I was like, this isn't going to happen. And so we battled over that first year, but I managed to finally convince him to stop taking it. The doctor, of course, was very upset. So we fired the doctor. He got a new doctor who was willing to put up with the fact that he wasn't taking it, but wasn't happy with it. And I'm happy to report that this many years later, he's doing fantastically well. He doesn't even take statins, but he even doesn't take other drugs at this point. He's drug free as far as pharmaceutical drugs are concerned, and doing great. So he didn't need the statin drug.
Well, that is actually, as I mentioned, how I first became aware of you, because there is that Thinks group, the cholesterol skeptics, and it's a wonderful group and a very highly qualified group. It's not some weekend people that are interested in healthcare. There's many like yourself, experienced researchers and PhDs who know how to analyze data and look at it. As I said, there's so much I want to talk to you about today, but you've raised this one, the cholesterol one, and what were some of your observations about that?
Oh, well,
about
it was
the cholesterol issue.
Well, it was really quite interesting, because my studies on I was working on autism and heart disease at the same time, and reading all the literature I could find and really absorbing the biology of it. I was fascinated by the biology of these two diseases. And I came to the conclusion early on, really before I even knew about glyphosate, I came to the conclusion that sulfate deficiency was behind both heart disease and autism. It was a common problem with both of them, which was quite an insight on my part. I felt really fascinated by that, and I identified in particular cholesterol sulfate deficiency in both diseases. And then I became concerned about cholesterol sulfate synthesis in the skin, and that kind of became my passion. So I wrote papers. I collaborated with some of the Thinks folks, actually, and wrote papers on cholesterol sulfate, and arguing that a deficiency in cholesterol sulfate is maybe even the primary factor behind heart disease. And even potentially autism. So it's quite remarkable. And heart disease turns out to be extremely interesting. And I've written several papers now describing how the macrophages go into the arteries feeding the heart, and they pile on the cholesterol. I mean, it's true. They store cholesterol and fat. They make these fatty deposits. They block the arteries. All of that's true. But the reason for it is the deficiency in sulfate. And so as soon as sulfate is supplied, that cholesterol is ready to go, to be released as cholesterol sulfate, which is a water-soluble molecule that can go into the membranes of the red blood cells, the LDL particles, and all these lipid particles in the blood can, the cholesterol sulfate will go into their membrane and protect them from oxidative and glycation damage. So cholesterol sulfate is a super important molecule for protection, which keeps the LDL particles from getting oxidized. And oxidized LDL is what causes the whole cycle of getting the heart disease. So it all makes sense to me that if you can just make the cholesterol sulfate and then you deliver it to the heart muscle, both the cholesterol and the sulfate are very important for the function of the heart. And that to me is the main story behind heart disease.
And that is what I found so interesting. I read the article that we're going to talk about sunlight and vitamin D, but this mention of sulfate is not one that I'm hearing a lot about. We hear
I know, I agree. I'm surprised.
We hear that cholesterol, like sunlight, is demonized and yet so central to our existence through human history. But I haven't heard the sulfate aspect of this. And while we're not a medical audience, this is an audience, our listener is a very well-educated or motivated person. But tell us a little bit about sulfate 101. Give it to us as simply as you can.
It's really, really interesting. I mean, sulfate is, it's overlooked because it's so common. And there's an assumption that there's plenty, even though there isn't. There's an assumption that we don't have a problem with supply. That's a false assumption. It populates the glycocalyx. So the glycocalyx is like what lines all the blood vessels. It's a layer of complicated complex sugar molecules. They're all sulfated at various places. So you can have more sulfate, less sulfate. There's places where it could be sulfated or not, depending upon how much sulfate there is. If there's sufficient sulfate, then it gets very well populated with sulfate, and that creates what's called exclusion zone water, which is gelled water. This is Jerry Pollack stuff. It's so fascinating. I really love his work.
Yes, and I've just read Thomas Cowan's book,
right.
on that.
I've read
it's interesting. I mean, the whole new science of water, which is a whole other topic we could go down a rabbit hole of.
Absolutely, yes. It's crucial because the sulfate is what is maintaining the healthy water, lining the blood vessels, and the healthy water is what's protecting. It's building a shield because it's exclusion zone water. It's called that for a reason because the water becomes like ice. It's like crystal water with the help of the sulfate. It becomes crystalline water, like a gel, like Jell-O, for example. I mean, it's quite intuitive. And it coats all the blood vessels. It makes a very slick surface for the red blood cells to just slide right through the capillary. So it provides minimal resistance for blood flow. And it's very crucial for circulation. But it also builds a shield which keeps stuff from getting in. You have all these things that are being carried in the blood, and they have to be delivered, and there's all special mechanisms. Sulfate is heavily involved in the mechanisms of delivery as well, things attached to the heparin sulfate. It's a complicated story, but it's controlling what gets in and what stays out in an important way to keep what's behind the wall safe. So the epithelial wall is healthy because of the sulfate. And the oxidizing and glycating agents are not having an effect. They're staying in the blood and not damaging the LDL particles, not damaging the red blood cells, the platelets. All of them are being saved by the sulfate, actually cholesterol sulfate in the membranes, that's keeping them from getting attacked by these reactive agents that are in the blood.
And I'm assuming that the statins reduce the cholesterol sulfate.
Exactly. Yeah, well, the statins, of course, are a train wreck for cholesterol because they interfere with the liver's ability to make cholesterol. And the liver needs to make cholesterol in order to have cholesterol sulfate. And in fact, when there's not, so the skin makes sulfate in response to sunlight. And that's where the vitamin D comes in too. The skin makes vitamin D. It makes sulfate and it combines them to make vitamin D sulfate as well as cholesterol sulfate, which are released from the skin in response to sunlight. And the vitamin D sulfate, I consider vitamin D to be a signaling molecule. And it's actually signaling, hey guys, we've got cholesterol sulfate, because it goes hand in hand with the cholesterol sulfate that's being synthesized in the skin with the sunlight. And statin drugs are going to, disrupt the supply of cholesterol, which is obviously going to deplete the supply of cholesterol sulfate.
I was always concerned early on in the statin story that, and it seems to be less talked about now, but when statins were first started, liver function tests were an important part of the protocol. In fact,
Yes.
3 monthly liver function tests, I think, was the way it was suggested. And now that's
Yes.
kind of, oh, well, is it because we've kind of given up on that one because it's so
I don't
ubiquitous?
know.
It's just
That's very strange. I mean, I certainly would want to know if my liver was functioning okay if I was taking a statin.
Yeah.
The other thing is, of course, these new drugs are very expensive. That's a shot. That's PCSK9 inhibitors. Have you heard about those?
I've heard, but I don't know.
Yeah, the
very
doctor's trying to pressure my husband to take that now because he won't take the statin, so maybe he'll take the PCSK9 inhibitor. Guess again.
Yeah.
But they're interesting because the PCSK9 is a protein that's produced in the liver, and it's a very high level regulating protein. And what it does is it binds and ties up the LDL receptor so they can't get back to the membrane, so they can't receive the LDL, so you can't return the LDL to the liver. So by building an inhibitor that messes them up, it frees up the LDL receptor to go to the membrane and pick up the LDL, return it, and reduce the LDL in the blood, which is the whole goal, right? Get low LDL in the blood by allowing the liver to return the LDL, even though the PCSK9 thinks it shouldn't. And the thing is, PCSK9 gets inhibited by sulfation. If it gets sulfated, it'll stop pestering those LDL receptors and allow them to go and return the LDL. So the problem is sulfate deficiency in the liver that's preventing the LDL receptors from going to the membrane.
Now, apart from avoiding statins, how do we improve our sulfates?
Get rid of glyphosate. Glyphosate is an absolute train wreck for sulfate in so many dimensions you can't imagine.
Okay.
That's why I was so excited when I started to look at glyphosate after I heard Don Huber talk, and I went back and started reading papers, and I could quickly see that it would disrupt many of the sulfate transporters. I've identified multiple. It's quite fascinating. There's two whole classes of molecules, the sterols, which come out from steroids, cholesterol, vitamin D, all the sex hormones, cortisol. Those are all part of a whole class of proteins, a class of molecules that come from cholesterol. And they're all sulfated in transit. Like the adrenal glands make a whole bunch of these and they ship them out. Cortisol makes out cortisol, and DHEA is another one. They ship them out. They're all sulfated. So the adrenal glands put lots of sulfate on everything they're making before they ship it out. When it's sulfated, it's inactive. So vitamin D sulfate, people looked at it a while ago, many years ago. Vitamin D sulfate, what's that about, right? And they tested, so this stuff doesn't work. I mean, it completely doesn't attach to the receptor, so it doesn't actually affect all the changes that vitamin D affects. Vitamin D sulfate is in some sense inert. It doesn't signal. But if you take the vitamin D, you deliver it, you take off the sulfate, you supply it to the glycocalyx, and then the vitamin D receptor can work. So what's happening is all these molecules, all these cholesterol-derived molecules are transporting sulfate around the body. And so are a whole other class of molecules called the aromatics. And the aromatics are very important with respect to glyphosate because glyphosate disrupts an enzyme in the shikimate pathway that produces the aromatic amino acids. And those are precursors to all kinds of things, including all the neurotransmitters, thyroid hormone, melanin, the skin tanning agent. All these things come out of that shikimate pathway. And the gut microbes use that pathway to make the aromatics, which then supply the sulfate, because then those serotonin, it gets sulfated in the gut. It's produced in the gut, sulfated in the gut, and shipped to the brain. So serotonin is delivering sulfate to the brain. And if you can't make serotonin, you can't deliver sulfate, the brain's going to become deficient.
Start seeing some mental health issues as well, which are fairly common in our world. You've said so much there. I wish I had my whiteboard in behind me and I could just make all these notes. But here we have the demonization of cholesterol and actually the utilization of statins. Yes. We have the demonization of sunlight and its ability to produce the vitamin D that we need. And we have the ubiquitous use of glyphosate, which interrupts all of those programs.
Exactly. You wonder why we're sick.
Yeah, it's the perfect storm. I mean, how do you, look, this is a much bigger question, stepping back from all of this, how do you reconcile these really bizarre public health initiatives? What are your thoughts?
I mean, I'm absolutely astonished that people haven't woken up. I feel like I'm screaming to the rooftops, and lots of my friends are too. And there's so many people I personally know who are very aware that we're in a mess. And And they're all trying to deliver the message that we're broken, that our healthcare system is broken, our food system is broken, we're prescribing way too many drugs. I mean, all of this is wrong. It's all wrong. And we're so sick. I mean, our country, United States, you know, the world's biggest spender of health care. Our healthcare is way out front compared to any other country.
Yes.
We take tons of drugs. We take way more drugs than anybody else. We're very sick. You know, we've got diabetes, obesity, Alzheimer's, autism, all these things, various neurological and autoimmune diseases, cancer. I mean, everything is just a mess in this country, I feel.
Yeah.
And yet we seem to be perfectly happy with our healthcare system to some extent. I mean, I don't get it, you know?
Yeah. I mean, we've been introduced to the word comorbidities through this pandemic. And of course, if you needed any evidence of the influence of comorbidities, it's why America is first, isn't it, really?
Absolutely. I mean, in fact, I think it's even more than comorbidities, as you know. I've really gotten excited about the idea of biofuels. And it was really something that I came up with that idea early on when I started to watch COVID-19, and especially when Italy got hit hard in Lombardy region. I knew that place was had toxic air. I mean, they've got a lot of issues with air pollution there. And I knew that Europe has been a leader in the biofuel industry, particularly biodiesel. You know, Europe, they use a percentage of biodiesel in them, not even just the trucks and buses, but also the cars in Europe. And a lot of that biodiesel is imported from Argentina, where they make it from GMO Roundup Ready soy. So you can imagine that might be contaminated with glyphosate. In the United States, we're a leader. So Europe and the United States are basically and also Brazil and Argentina. I would say those are the leaders in the biofuel industry. And when you look in the United States at where the epidemic is hitting the hardest, every time I find a new hotspot, I can find a reason why biofuel would be causing it. It's quite remarkable. And starting, of course, with New York City. You probably haven't followed the details of America, but New York City really had a huge onset of the disease. Oh, yeah. With the hospitals being overflowing and not enough ICU and all that kind of stuff. And, you know, just tremendous rise in infectivity in New York City. And so I started to look at New York City with respect to biofuels, and they're an absolute leader. They're one of the first, three big cities. There was New York City, New Orleans, and Washington, D.C. that were kind of the real leaders in that space. They're all situated on major waterways, and that's part of why it works, because you take all this, like what we do in our country is the biomass that's left over after you harvest the crop. So, for example, the wheat crop, you spray the wheat with glyphosate just a few days before harvest. And then, of course, you dump glyphosate into the food supply, which is why we have an epidemic in gluten intolerance. But that's another story. And then you take what's left over, the stalks, and you pile them on a barge and ship them down to New York City. And they've got all these factories where they turn the crank and produce diesel fuel, or they can produce biogas, or they can produce bioheating oil. I mean, there's all these different versions of biofuels that come out of this process. They also use the outputs of the sewer system. So there's like this huge 50-acre spot in New York City on the edge of this creek called Newtown Creek, which separates Brooklyn from Queens. And Brooklyn and Queens are the epicenter of the epicenter in the United States. New York got hit the hardest. Within New York, New York City. Within New York City, Brooklyn and Queens. The very worst hit when it started to catch on in this country. And that creek is very toxic. I mean, it's had a long history of stuff dumped in there. It's got thick oil, residue on the bottom and all of that. But this site, it handles the New York sewer, and processes the sewer stuff. It also adds food elements to it. They've learned how to sort of pile in some waste food, like some waste oils, and they're kind of throwing the kitchen sink in there, it sounds like to me, and then turning the crank. When they add these food waste, they can actually produce a larger percentage of yield of actually usable fuel and help to prevent the release of methane gas, which is going to hurt global climate change. So it's like a good thing to do. It's argued as being a very progressive and far-sighted idea to try to stop global climate change, all this good stuff. But if you've got glyphosate in the food, in the human waste, and in the food waste and in the crop waste, all these things have glyphosate in them. I think you're going to get glyphosate in your product. And then if you've got an old bus with a poor an engine that's not well tuned, you've got smoke spewing out the back. I'll bet you there's glyphosate in there.
Mm. And that, to remind us about glyphosate, and I thought this was interesting, that it's not just a herbicide, but it's a desiccant, which dries out a crop and makes it easier to harvest, because green stalks are much more difficult to harvest. So why not spray them and dry them out? What a wonderful idea.
Well, and in fact, for canola in particular, I found an article on the web that talked about so sometimes they grow canola just as a fuel crop. They don't even want any food out of it. And then in this article, they said it's really a good idea to add glyphosate to the crop right before you harvest it, because then it'll be much easier to scrape up all that stuff and throw it on the barge. So I imagine they're doing that, with the canola and certainly the soybeans. With the soybeans are GMO Roundup ready, so they're going to be using that on the soybeans. Wheat is another one, and I told you wheat, and also sugarcane. Sugarcane is sprayed right before harvest as well. And then you've got all the cows. They've got the manure, so that's another thing they add. They'll mix in manure from the cows, and also the waste from the meat processing industry. There's lots of meat processing plants, not only in the United States. I know also in Germany there was a meat processing plant that had a huge epidemic. They have a lot of outbreaks in meat processing plants throughout this country. We're having it too.
Yeah, and I'm assuming the manure is coming from the CAFOs, the feeding lots. They're not coming from the grass-fed and finished regenerative. That would be a bonus. But that is a problem as well, because within those animals, full of antibiotics and chemicals and hormones to keep them alive. We wouldn't say healthy.
So when you're processing the meat, there's glyphosate in the meat as well, but they also in the fat. I mean, the animals are contaminated with glyphosate throughout because it accumulates in the tissues. And but these meat processing plants are figuring out how to have a nearby site where they turn the waste from the meat processing plant into biofuel, into biogas, and then they use that biogas to fuel the plant. So if they've got any gas leaks in the gas lines, there's your glyphosate. I mean, I really think glyphosate is a tremendous sensitizer for COVID-19. And that's the other piece of the puzzle, is to look at the e-cigarette story. And I wrote about that in an article, in multiple articles that I've written, because that's so fascinating. People who smoke e-cigarettes. And I knew about this before COVID-19 even hit. I was looking into it. I was puzzled. I was thinking, these e-cigarettes, maybe they've got glyphosate. Because I'm always thinking, if I see some strange disease, I'm always thinking glyphosate.
And is that what you found?
That's what I think. Now, I haven't tested anything. I've got to... I don't do testing. I really probably should get into the business of testing, but I haven't. I'm trying to get other people interested in testing. But the thing that was interesting about the e-cigarettes was that the primary ingredient of the base, the solvent that you put the nicotine into, is glycerol. And glycerol is a major waste product of the biofuel industry. It produces lots of glycerol as a byproduct when you extract the fuel. And so they are looking for ways to use that glycerol, because they've got a glut of the glycerol market right now because of the increased activity of the biofuel industry. So I think that it's probably was a motivator for why they came up with the idea of e-cigarettes in the first place back in the 2008 timeframe. So I think the glycerol has glyphosate in it. And when you smoke the e-cigarette, you're breathing in the glyphosate. And then the glyphosate really disrupts the lungs' immune response. And I think that causes the virus to, first of all, the immune system is unable to clear the virus. When you get exposed, you can't clear it. The virus has a field day and starts multiplying wildly, and now you're coughing it up, and so you're spreading it to everybody else. So I think the infection rate goes way up in a situation where everybody's breathing glyphosate. It greatly increases the chance for someone to pass it on to someone else or to get very sick from it.
Now, glyphosate Roundup is, of course, a Monsanto product, which is, of course, now a Bayer company. And I believe Bayer just made a contribution of something like $12 billion or $10 billion to a group of people. Can you share with us why that was not just an act of generosity? It's just to remind us of how serious this issue is, and even in the law courts, they would agree.
Right. And that started with Dwayne Johnson. I remember I was here in Hawaii. I was in the water, and my husband was looking at his phone, and he got this announcement that Dwayne had won this. We were watching that lawsuit very carefully. Dwayne Johnson in California accused glyphosate of causing his non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. It was the only chemical he had been using, and he was using it on schoolyards, which is also just really painful to think about. And yeah, he was young. He had young kids, and he was your heart went out to him, and he had a jury trial, and he won a big award. I think it was like $350 million, and then it was immediately or pretty soon thereafter cut way back by the judge. The jury awarded him a huge amount of money. The judge cut it back to something like 78 million. And very recently, just the last couple of days, it's gone through an appeals court, and it has survived the appeal completely intact. Monsanto, everything was denied as far as Monsanto was trying to say this and that weren't true. They denied everything, but they again reduced the amount. So I don't know at what point he's going to get exhausted waiting for that money to show up, because Monsanto or Bayer just keeps on raising it to the higher court. Yeah. But that was the first one. Then there were two more after that. Also got big awards from jury trials. So it was really looking like a pattern. And then there's this huge class action. There's multiple class action lawsuits, but this particular one is a large number of people. I don't know how many, but it's thousands. Yeah, so it's a small amount to each person, And
I think it was 12,000, and each got $250,000, which in the scheme of things is not that much.
Yeah.
But the point being,
better than nothing. Yeah.
Better than nothing.
They lost.
Yes, and part of the problem, of course, with your system in America and to some degree ours in Australia, is that we don't work on the precautionary principle. We let things run, and if the courts deem it to be illegal, then action may be taken.
Yeah, it's a huge step forward. I was so excited when I heard that. I did not expect Dwayne Johnson to have a chance. I just expected Monsanto would be so powerful they wouldn't let it happen. And I was so delighted. I'm still sort of riding on a high because of that, because I think it's really had impact. And it also brought much more public awareness to glyphosate, which caused more people to be interested in eating organic. So it's become random people have become much more aware of the toxicity of glyphosate in the past few years, and this really pleases me. And I've seen the rise in the use of organic, and the amount of organic that's available on the shelves of the grocery stores, even the common grocery stores, is going up dramatically. You can get organic food pretty easily now in the United States. It's certainly where I live.
And that's what I found so interesting about this article that you shared with me. It hasn't quite come out yet, I don't think. But anyway, it was this connection between biofuels and biomass, which sounds like a wonderful idea. But glyphosate, and you also make the point that while correlation doesn't mean causation, the actual correlation, when it gets to that level is pretty significant. It was pretty correlative, wasn't it?
Well, it's quite remarkable. And then I've been looking, every time there's an outbreak somewhere, I'll take a look. And like Dallas, Texas was one. And then I found this huge I found several different, it was a meat processing plant in Dallas, Texas. And that industry was proud of the fact that they had been able to use this anaerobic biodigester to produce biogas, to fuel the plant. So you can feel that's going to be exposure, And then Arizona is getting hit hard now. And there's this small county, Santa Cruz County at the Mexican border has the highest infection rate in all of Arizona. And so I was just looking at Arizona biofuel, and sure enough, Santa Cruz, that's where there's a biofuel activity going on there. I saw something from 2008, 2013, 2014 web pages reporting on this exciting thing in Arizona, Santa Cruz biofuel. So, it's just like Germany had a meat processing plant that was hit hard by COVID-19, and I looked it up, and sure enough, there was like a big sewer system combination thing where they were pulling the waste from the meat processing plant, combining it to human waste, and turning out making biofuel. So it's like, every time I hear about a place that's hit hard, in Boston, you have Chelsea is the hardest hit by far, the town of Chelsea. I know the town well. We drive through it on the way to the airport. It's right next to the airport. It has these huge storage tanks for airport. It stores all the fuel for the airlines. And airline fuel also has biofuel in it. There's an aviation biofuel that's been under development since like 2008, and it's been increasing. Biofuel has been going up dramatically in the last couple of years, both in the United States and in Brazil, by the way. The United States and Brazil are the two major leaders in the biofuel industry. And they're also the two hardest hit countries in terms of COVID-19 deaths. We have a much higher death rate in Brazil and the United States than they do elsewhere in the world. And the two leaders in glyphosate, lots of glyphosate usage as well as lots of biofuel. So it's a pretty strong pattern. When you look, it's just quite amazing that You can pretty much find the answer every time you hear about a particular place that's hard hit. You can explain it through the biofuel, potential for biofuel exposure.
Now, one of the things that I also want to talk to you about, because I also read another wonderful article you wrote on sunlight and vitamin D, and the fact that they're not the same thing, and we've demonized sunlight before, for a long time now. Tell us some of the problems with demonizing sunlight. What are some of the good things? I mean, we kind of know, but it'd be lovely to have it laid out for us.
Cholesterol sulfate. Talked about it already, right? But vitamin D for sure. I mean, the thing is, I think when you take a vitamin D supplement, you're missing the point because you're taking it out of context. Vitamin D by itself. If you eat a food that's naturally has vitamin D in it, it's also going to have cholesterol sulfate in it. So vitamin D, I think, is in a way a signal. Hey, you've got cholesterol sulfate. And vitamin D also is interesting because it goes through a lot of steps before it becomes active. It goes to the liver and it gets converted to a 25 hydroxy vitamin D, and then it goes to the kidneys and it gets converted into 1,25 hydroxy vitamin D, and then it's active. Then it can be received and cause change, metabolic policy decisions in the cells that are generally good. But if you're taking huge doses of vitamin D, first of all, you're distracting the liver CYP enzymes. They have to be busy activating the vitamin D instead of doing other more important jobs like, oxidizing cholesterol and making bile acids and detoxing toxic chemicals. I mean, there's a lot of things that those cytochrome P450 enzymes do. I think vitamin D is actually a signaling molecule. First of all, if it's produced in the skin, assuming that it's been produced alongside cholesterol sulfate, it becomes a signal, hey, you got cholesterol sulfate. It goes to the liver and says, oh, hey, your CYP enzymes are working. It goes to the kidney, oh, your CYP enzymes are working in the kidney as well, because the CYP enzymes are getting messed up by glyphosate, among other things. Lots of chemicals mess up the cytochrome P450 enzymes, and that causes a lot of problems. But so the vitamin D is sort of checking off these things and then finally getting activated, and then it can go ahead and signal to the cells, hey guys, everything's good. You can go ahead with business as usual. So if it doesn't make it through all those hoops, then those are indicators that there's trouble, and you'll have low vitamin D, and you'll have susceptibility to all kinds of problems. And of course, a weakened immune system, because the immune cells really depend upon the vitamin D signal to indicate that everything's okay.
And we kind of talked about, sunlight is one thing in relation to vitamin D, but there's also melatonin as well, isn't it?
Yes, right.
Which we're missing out on. And melatonin's a pretty important molecule, isn't it?
It absolutely is, yeah. Are you thinking of melanin, the skin tanning agent, or melatonin, the...
Well, melanin, the skin tanning agent is one thing, but melatonin another. Yeah. Let's talk about each of those, because people don't hear a lot about melanin. And that has an important protective function.
It does. And in fact, that's one concern with glyphosate, because melanin comes out of the shikimate pathway. So I'm assuming that if glyphosate is disrupting the gut microbes, they won't be able to make enough of those precursors to make melatonin and melanin. Both of them come out of that shikimate pathway. So if you have a melanin deficiency, then you can't tan. And so then the sun can become toxic, because you have a natural protection against the sun through the tanning process. I always advocate people should get out in the sun in the spring when the sun's not so harsh, and build up a tan, so by the time they get to the summer, they can be out on the boat on the ocean no problem, because they've got that suntan to protect them. But if glyphosate's preventing their ability to actually have a suntan because there's not enough melanin, that's not going to work. And the sun is going to become toxic, and you're going to get things like skin cancer, which is, of course, the thing they always say, that you've got to stay out of the sun. The skin doctor says, stay out of the sun, take the vitamin D supplement, right?
And put on the
sun sunscreen. Is toxic.
And
put on the sunscreen.
And sunscreen's got its own story.
Sunscreen's got its own story, yeah. And they use aluminum in the sunscreen. The high-end sunscreens, they use this aluminum to sort of make the zinc oxide more palatable for spreading, for putting on, not being like a white paste. It makes it more easily spread. And the aluminum is it also, like glyphosate, disrupts the CYP enzymes, and the enzyme that we believe makes sulfate is called endothelial nitric oxide synthase. I've written a lot about it, and it is essentially like a CYP enzyme, and it's going to be susceptible to aluminum poisoning as well as to glyphosate poisoning. And so I think it's getting disrupted as well by the glyphosate, by the aluminum. So the sunscreen is not only keeping you from making the vitamin D, but it's also keeping you from keeping your own system from working properly to make even the cholesterol sulfate.
See, I often do say on this podcast that the way our system works, it's just such a great economic model. You know, it's fed by the chemical and the food industry. It's managed by the pharmaceutical industry. I mean, if you wanted a perfect economic model, our health, the way we approach our health is the perfect way to do it. It's just not a very good health model.
It's a good monetary model.
It's a good
and
monetary
they're the same industry too, right?
Yeah.
Bayer is a pharmaceutical company and they
Absolutely.
own Monsanto. It's the same industry.
Now, another one, the melatonin also, we associate melatonin with sleep.
Yes.
But it's also such an important regulatory hormone as well, isn't it? A molecule.
It's a wonderful, wonderful molecule. The more I read about it, the more I'm interested in learning more. In fact, it's been showing up in COVID-19 papers. I don't know if you realize, but they're advocating melatonin as a treatment for COVID-19, which is interesting. It's a fantastic antioxidant, and it can bind metals and help to protect you from metal toxicity. And of course, it's a product of the shikimate pathway. It's actually produced from serotonin. So you have the serotonin that's made in the gut in large amounts from the precursors that are blocked by glyphosate. And then the serotonin gets sulfated in the gut and it gets shipped to the brain. It delivers sulfate to the brain. And then it becomes a precursor to melatonin. And then melatonin also gets sulfated. Actually, the melatonin that's in the cerebral spinal fluid is sulfated. So I think the melatonin is actually delivering sulfate to the brain at night while you sleep. And that sulfate is very important for clearing cellular debris. That's another role that it plays, besides this electrical system, the water that I mentioned. Sulfate creates a very acidic, it can buffer acidic water. So we have the lysosomes that are the digestive system of the cell, and they use sulfate to help maintain their very low pH, which allows them to break things down. So when there's not enough sulfate, and when the melatonin can't deliver the sulfate, the brain can't clear the debris. And now you get things like Alzheimer's because you've got this amyloid beta plaque that you can't clear.
Yeah, and it's also implicated in mitochondrial regulation, isn't it, melatonin?
Absolutely, absolutely. It's very interesting there.
Yeah, there's so much going on there. And now listen, we could go on talking about so many things, and I actually was intrigued that your background is in artificial intelligence, AI, and all the things that you described about, Siri and Amazon and da-da-da-da-da. But AI is also presenting itself as some kind of existential threat to humanity. Bet you never saw that coming.
I didn't. I tell you, when I was working on it, it looked like it was such a hopeless task to get this stuff to work that it was never going to be. I was really amazed that it became something that was, able to go into the general usage. I was delighted about that our work, actually became something that was a product you could sell. Because in the early days, things were working so badly, we didn't think it was ever going to work. But I did not think about all the issues of surveillance and all this, all the being able to recognize your face and be able to track you and all those things that are happening now with it. And also, of course, taking over jobs, the robotics and whatnot. So many jobs, and even high-level jobs are going to start disappearing. Jobs that involve, for example, preparing a legal report. There's going to be ways you can kind of just grab a bunch of stuff and automatically throw it together and produce a document that's a first cut that's 90% there, and have the computer just do that. So that's the kind of work we did with the sort of language processing. There's a rich space there that's probably going to take over jobs that today are well-paying jobs, and they're not considered, they're not like factory jobs.
Not to mention the algorithms which can predict our what we might like to read next, or look at next, which is probably the most frightening aspect of the whole thing.
And of course, all the filtering that they're doing by analyzing the content of materials and then deciding that it's fake news and you can't publish it. The AI technology is involved in making those decisions about what's okay for people to see and what isn't. Which are.
Now listen, we're coming to the end, and I know I wanted to ask you one last thing, and I wanted to ask you to take a step back from your role as a researcher at M.I.T. and a person who's interested in all these. You've written so many articles, because we're all on this health journey through life in our modern world. What do you think the biggest challenge is for an individual on that journey?
Wow, stay away from pharma. I mean, I think we really have to pay tremendous attention to our food. by not only by organic, but by non-processed foods, wholesome, whole foods, minimal processing, or just buy top of the line food. When you buy eggs, don't just buy organic eggs, buy outdoor, never caged, all the different things. No, of course, no antibiotics and whatnot, but just be very careful to buy high-end food, and in a sense, not see it as too expensive, because I think, of course, there's people who don't have a lot of money and they're concerned about trying to be frugal in their food choices, and that gets difficult because, of course, the organic at the moment costs more. But they need to understand that it's worth it, because if they get really sick, it's going to be so much more expensive than the extra money they spent for the quality food. So just eat really wholesome and nutrient dense, high sulfur. I mean, we really work hard on eating sulfur containing foods. And of course, getting out in the sunlight, making sure you have plenty of sunlight exposure, and take off the glasses. I've never used sunglasses, and I don't believe in them, and I don't even believe in glasses anymore. I stopped wearing my glasses maybe 10 years ago, and I found out I didn't need them. Or my eyes actually got better to the point where I just didn't need them anymore. So I think we've been told, to be afraid of the sun, we should worship the sun. And if you live by the ocean, walking on the beach, in the water, barefoot, is about one of the healthiest things you can do, especially on a sunny day. The ocean air and the grounding, because you're getting a negative charge, from very, very good grounding when you're walking in the water. So getting outdoors even just walking in the woods, walking outside in very pretty places that are as far away from civilization as you can find is what I like. Stay away from the pollution, the air pollution in the cities, stay away from the highways. Even maybe take the back roads to work if you can, rather than getting on the highway, because there's not going to be as much toxic air. Little steps like that can make a difference, I think.
Well, Stephanie, that's all music to our ears, and to hear it coming from you makes it even more meaningful. So thank you so much today for joining us and sharing your wisdom with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, it's head spinning, isn't it? There are so many connections. We're told that cholesterol is a problem, and not only told to avoid cholesterol containing foods, but the use of statins, which is referred to as a blockbuster because they generate more than $1 billion worth of sales every year, is ubiquitous. In fact, the biggest selling one, Lipitor, has sold over the last 10 or 12 years about $120 billion worth of sales. So it is a huge industry, and many practitioners, many so-called experts in the field, which include many cardiologists, have built their whole careers on keeping cholesterol as low as possible. And that's not an easy thing to let go when your reputation depends on it, when you've built your whole practice around it. So there we are, taking statins to lower our cholesterol, which is so vital to so many of the body's important protective functions. A great economic model. Then we're told to stay out of the sunlight, which produces vitamin D and melatonin, which vitamin D is often referred to as an anti-cancer drug, but it's implicated in absolutely every disease that you can imagine. So now we have vitamin D deficiencies, and interestingly, during this COVID crisis, pandemic, vitamin D levels. We're going to do a whole program on vitamin D as well, because it's so critically important. But of course, staying out of the sun affects vitamin D levels, and taking a supplement may seem like a good idea, but as you heard, getting out in the sun, exposing your skin and importantly your eyes to that as well, produces a whole range of far more complex molecules which have an important role to play. And then, of course, isn't biofuels and biomass a great idea? Well, yes, it probably is, but it depends how that biofuel and biomass is grown. And of course, glyphosate is a topic we've touched on a few of our podcasts, and we'll touch on again in the future. And its correlation with diseases are not just minor. When you look at the statistics, it is highly correlated to the incidence of many diseases. And I'll share with you an interesting graph on that as well. So, a lot there, and I'll have some articles, which I will link to some articles that Stephanie has written, and I'll link them in the show notes. Now, don't forget that we've got some amazing online programs coming. We've got the Unstressed with Dr. Ron Ehrlich app, which keeps you informed of all of those things. Don't forget also to leave a review on our on the iTunes, and now we're recording these. So, and when we record them and they're available on YouTube, when I get really good at editing, I can drop some really interesting images in with that. And I think it's rather nice seeing our faces as well. So if you're listening to this as an audio, well, continue to do so. But if you're wanting to put some faces to names and see some additional stuff, have a look at the YouTube. That's becoming a little more sophisticated as we go along. So until next time, this is Dr. Ron Ehrlich. Be well. This podcast provides general information and discussion about medicine, health, and related subjects. The content is not intended and should not be construed as medical advice or as a substitute for care by a qualified medical practitioner. If you or any other person has a medical concern, he or she should consult with an appropriately qualified medical practitioner. Guests who speak in this podcast express their own opinions, experiences, and conclusions.